Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to look at who was Posidonius of Apamea or of Rhodes, was a Greek politician, astronomer, astrologer, geographer, historian, mathematician, and teacher native to Apamea in Syria. But what he did have an influence over was the work of many later Stoics, most notably Cicero. His teachings were also likely influential on Roman poetry of the Augustan period. First off, most of what we know about Posidonius' actual teachings comes from Roman writers, specifically Cicero and his contemporary, the elder Cato. Both of them refer back to Posidonius as a major philosophical influence. This is the only work that survives in its entirety, thanks to a manuscript found at Herculaneum. His influence is most evident in Roman literature, even though he probably worked primarily in Athens. The elder Cato dedicated his entire ethical system to him. Cicero, as we've seen, learned important lessons from him. Even Ovid mentions him in Metamorphoses. So he clearly had a reputation. But unfortunately, we know next to nothing about what he taught or even what he looked like. In fact, even his date of death is unknown. All we have are a few anecdotes and citations of his work. So this is someone whose life and thought deserve a lot more investigation. That said, I hope I've done him justice and shown that he deserves to be remembered. And so while we have no idea what most of Posidonius' work looked like, we do have this one text. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. And it's actually not really an invective at all, but rather a defense of astrology. Posidonius here is defending his friend Aristarchus against an unnamed critic. The unnamed critic accuses the astronomers of being atheists. Aristarchus defends himself by saying that while he does pay attention to the stars and their movements, he understands the gods as somehow causing these phenomena. And so both he and Posidonius understood astrology as compatible with religious belief. Later Christians appropriated parts of this text in order to criticize pagan astrology. In his Tusculan Disputations, Cicero tells us that he learned three things from Posidonius: how to get up early, how to make decisions quickly, and how to think calmly and without distraction. This description suggests a kind of philosophical mentor. In contrast, Cicero describes the teaching of the Stoics Zeno and Cleanthes as something more systematic and theoretical. It seems that Poseidon was perhaps less interested in systematically building up a philosophical system and more interested in the application of philosophy to daily life. In another place, Cicero credits Poseidon with giving him the habit of thinking about death constantly. This idea of memento mori, or remember that you will die, is a central theme in Stoic philosophy. But again, it doesn't seem that Posidonius built his teaching around something like this. Posidonius has been called the grandfather of the Stoics because of his influence over later Stoics such as Cicero and the elder Cato. This work had a huge impact on later Stoics, especially Marcus Aurelius. Unfortunately, none of it has survived. But Cicero tells us that Cato's entire ethical system was based on the doctrine of Posidonius. What exactly this means is hard to say, but it certainly suggests that Cato agreed with Posidonius on fundamental questions about ethics, politics, and nature. In addition to these anecdotes, Cicero and the elder Cato also cite Posidonius on various matters. This is usually in the form of short pithy sayings that are supposed to capture some kind of truth about the world or about how one should live. Most of these maxims are pretty vague and could fit into many different philosophical systems. For example, we have the maxim things present are always snatching us away from those absent. In itself, this saying is pretty ambiguous. I think it means that our thoughts are always wandering to the future or to the past, and that we should focus on the present moment. But of course, this is just one interpretation. Other examples include we waste more time imagining what might happen than actually doing something. This saying captures the idea that worrying about things we cannot control is a bad use of our time. Or, to be hindered is sometimes better than to be helped. This one's a little harder to parse, but I think it means that accepting obstacles sometimes helps us grow. In any case, you get the idea. This epithet comes from the fact that Posidonius himself was not a Stoic, but he was definitely an important precursor to the Stoa. He is sometimes called the last of the pre-Socratic philosophers. He also fits in chronologically between the earlier pre-Socratics like Pythagoras and the Socratics like Plato. So the label makes some sense. He was born around 350 BC in the Syrian city of Apamea and died sometime after 279 BC. We know this because according to Pliny the Elder, a list of 84 philosophers whose works were in the library of the city of Rhodes included Posidonius, and the list was contemporary with the death of Attalus III in 279 BC. And we also know that Posidonius was alive before 327 BC since he was a disciple of the philosopher Pyrrho of Elis. He is actually one of the first people that we can identify as part of the broader school of philosophy known as Pyrrhonism, which we would come to know as skepticism. He is one of the most prominent philosophers of the Hellenistic period, but there are very few surviving texts from him. In fact, we only know his name survives because it's cited by Roman authors. The earliest source we have for Poseidon's life is Plutarch's essay on him in the Parallel Lives, where he is paired with Alexander the Great. There is a great deal of mythology in Plutarch's account of Poseidon's life. And while it is quite interesting, we probably shouldn't take much of it as historical. According to Plutarch, Poseidon was born into wealth and was sent to live with his uncle in Rhodes, where he studied philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. While in Rhodes, Poseidon fell in love with a handsome young man named Aristarchus, who became a famous astronomer in his own right. They traveled together to see the pyramids of Egypt. He is said to have sailed to India, Arabia, and other distant lands. Plutarch claims that he was a close friend of Demetrius Poliorcetes, the general and king of Macedon, and that he helped mediate the end of the Galatian invasion of Asia Minor in 279 BCE. And finally, Plutarch says that Poseidon settled down in Athens, where he lived for some time in poverty but eventually acquired a noble widow as his wife. Through her, he gained access to political office and ultimately became a member of the Areopagus. Eventually, he fled to Rome, where he spent his last days. Again, Plutarch tells us very little about what Poseidon actually taught, but the story is filled with references to astrology and astronomy. For example, Plutarch says that Poseidonius used the observation of a solar eclipse to warn Demetrius that an invasion would fail if it was postponed for one day. Another story tells how Poseidonius predicted a flood by noting the behavior of certain plants. These stories obviously don't tell us much about what he actually taught, but they do give us a sense of what people expected of someone with his kind of knowledge. The major problem with Posidonius is that everything we know about him comes either directly from other ancient authors or indirectly through later citations of his work. So now let's look at what sources tell us about Poseidonius the philosopher. The other person most influenced by Posidonius was the elder Cato, who wrote an extensive philosophical treatise called On Duty. In addition to these scattered remarks, there was also a longer extant work attributed to Posidonius called Invective against the Astronomers. So what can we conclude about Posidonius? Well, it's clear that he was an extremely influential figure in the later Hellenistic period. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like and consider subscribing.